the Institute has initiated a number of very specific primary goals as they go about their extremely potent and powerful work. And the goal two relates to parents. And one of the things that is of enormous importance is to understand the individuality of the issues that face us. For example, when you, in the institution of enslaving people of African ancestry, you removed that parent model from what they had known in the motherland because they were separated from their parents and they were given to people who had custody over them, but not parental involvement, not as the role of a parent who would teach and love and protect, but rather as a person to use them for their own benefit. So we have to go back to look at what parents' support and parenting was like when people of African ancestry were living in their own milieu. Now, when we look at today, and we look at policies that are developed for parent advocacy, very often they start after the person is a parent. And I feel that considering the nature of the history of enslavement and the history of the destruction of models of family, the inability of families to flourish because of economic instability, the bias in terms of employment and in terms of education, even though the higher education institutions very often had enslaved laborers as the people who built those institutions, even though they denied access. So the parent piece is extremely important. And it is my belief that for people of African ancestry, we must begin before the person becomes a parent. The idea of pre-parenting, which is not a part of the curriculum, but we know one of the things that's almost inevitable in the life of adults is that they will have children through a variety of relationships, marriage, forced being together, as was happened in chattel slavery, where you did not marry, you were not allowed to marry, and still you had children. So what does that do to this model of parenting? That's why I believe that we need to do pre-parenting. I would say in terms of middle grades, certainly by high schools, we should know something about human sexuality. That should be a part of what we teach African American children, because the chattel slave experience was a destructive experience in terms of relationships between the male and the female, because the forced cohabitation in order to increase the slave trade had nothing to do with being a parent. So how do you get this concept of parenting? It is that we look at pre-parenting, and in ancient Africa and even in modern Africa, the men took the boys away and taught them how to be men, how to hunt, how to fish, how to protect, how to build. And the women took the girls and taught them how to be mothers before they became mothers. And we don't do that today. And I think that the fact that that chattel slave experience very often discouraged conversation between mothers and daughters about human sexuality and having children and what that meant and how to choose a mate. So I think that we have an enormous issue here in terms of parent advocacy and pre-parent preparation. Now, once that child is born and we understand the responsibilities economically, psychologically, spiritually in raising a child, then we're ready to talk about parenting. Because before that, it could just be a happening. It had nothing to do with developing relationships with the person that you choose to be the child's father, or developing a way of protecting this child and giving him a sense of his dignity and erasing that educational identity of disadvantaged, culturally deprived, at risk, and all those pejoratives, and gives the child rather a sense of history, a sense of his dignity, a sense of his value, a sense of his worth. And then when it comes to the school experience, very often we don't have a choice. We have to go to the school that we're zoned to. And very often parents go when the children are very young, but then as they get into middle school and high school, parents are less visible. I suggest that from the time the child enters the school situation, whether it's pre-kindergarten or kindergarten, that parents keep a journal for each of those children so they know who the teacher was, that they know how many times the teacher was absent. And my parents at 21, they would keep a record of how many times the teacher was absent and there was no substitute, and the class was called, in quotes, divided. The children didn't say the class was divided. They said they were divided. So if they were a fifth grader and the teacher was absent and there was no sub, they might have been sent to a fourth grade. They might have been sent to a third grade because you might have had 30 children to disperse through the building. And so parents keeping a journal of the history of what is happening with that child and how to advocate for that child. Go to the PTA meetings. If there isn't a PTA, organize one. Prepare yourself to go to the school board meetings. Learn the Roberts Rules of Order so you're able to feel confident if you want to question something that is being said, or learn how to read the budget and how the budget is appropriated. All of this is part of parent advocacy, to be informed and to be seriously informed and to make sure that you keep a record so that you can go back and say, my child was retained in the second grade, but had the same teacher. Didn't have what was different about it? Saying the same thing over that they had not been successful at before. In addition to that, in terms of parent advocacy, it is important that we help parents to understand the importance of the child's health. There are times when parents don't know that a child can't see because the child can't tell you he can't see. He hasn't been able to have a comparison between when he could see and he no longer can see, like an adult whose eyes may be failing. So that a pediatric examination is very important in terms of vision and in terms of hearing, so that that child is able to function adequately in an academic setting because they are healthy. Sickle cell anemia and diseases that are very prevalent in communities of color need to be a part of the requirement, just as they have to have vaccinations for measles and whooping cough. There should be tests to determine if there is a sickle cell trait or if there's actually sickle cell. And the idea of lead poisoning. People who live in poor conditioned housing, very often there's lead in the paint, and that lead has a sweet taste, and the children will eat that lead, and that not only will they have lead then in their health issue, but in their brain, which affects the way they learn, particularly reading and mathematics. And when we looked at the incidence of lead poisoning in children who were in special ed placement, we found that almost 90% of those children had some incidence of lead poisoning, not just in the blood that's taken in a test, but in the brain. So parent advocacy includes pre-parenting, it includes selecting the person, knowing what it means to be a parent when you do not have a support system, when you do not necessarily have a knowledge of the patterns of parenting from the continent of Africa, where people had children. They don't have orphanages. There's no such thing as a child not having a parent because the parent is deceased. So all of this is a part of this very important second goal that the Institute has, parent advocacy.